Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 297. This week the questions are taken from guides 374 and 375 on the Flower class sloops of World War I and the Black Swan class sloops of World War II, along with the Wednesday videos on the origins of the torpedo and Rottnest Island in Australia, plus the Friday video on HMS Java versus USS Constitution. That's the frigate duels of the War of 1812 series. So let's begin with questions. A.H. Eaton asks, or A.H. Seaton maybe, asks, when were lifeboats for passengers first required to be added to ships? Was it the age of sail, early steam paddle wheelers, screw-driven steamers, 18th, 19th, 20th century? Titanic famously didn't have enough lifeboats. What was the evolution of lifeboat regulations? Lifeboats as a distinct thing, as opposed to just general ship's boats, which may be useful in the event of an emergency, pretty much started to come about around about the same time as you started to see dedicated passenger liners or passenger ships, as we would think of them today. And that means you're looking at the early, verging on early mid-19th century. Before that, you would have merchant ships, and by and large they would generally be carrying cargo. Now, of course, you would have some ships, particularly colony ships, settling ships, etc., transportation ships, and obviously slave ships, which carried large numbers of people and, comparatively speaking, relatively little cargo, but they were not purpose-built for the most part for that kind of trade. They were mostly just merchant ships where there just wasn't cargo and they had them full of people instead. And in that time period, as I said, ships would have boats, and if something went wrong, then, well, you took the boats if any of them were still around. But there was also the added advantage, if you can call it that, of the fact if you were in a wooden ship and the wooden ship started to break up because it was sinking, a lot of components of that ship would double as flotation aids or even material to build a raft from if you happen to end up in that kind of situation. It's only, as I said, when you get to the 19th century and you have ships regularly plying their trade, predominantly carrying passengers, that the need for dedicated lifeboats begins to become a thing. And there's various bits of legislation enacted in different countries, some of them initially mandating that you just should have boats in good repair, generally. Later on that becomes specifically lifeboats. And then towards the latter part of the 19th century, in the UK, for example, with the Merchant Shipping Act, and there's a whole ton of them, but 1854, 1870, 1894, various ones, you start to see the introduction of specific requirements for lifeboats based on the gross registered tonnage of the ship in question. So it wasn't a case of, oh, well, this particular ship can carry X number of people, therefore it should have Y number of boats, because, of course, boats can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. But it was a case of, well, we estimate that a ship of, say, 1,000 gross registered tons can carry so many people, so therefore we're going to mandate that you must carry X number of boats, where X is the number of boats capable of taking that many people, plus a little bit extra. They weren't being particularly cruel about it, they were ensuring there was a little bit of overcapacity. The problem with that legislation, which is what you would find with the Titanic, was that around about the same time that legislation was being passed, the tonnage of ships, thanks to the explosion of efficient steam propulsion and steel for shipbuilding as opposed to iron, suddenly led to a massive increase in the gross registered tonnage, and obviously displacement as well, of various liners. And the problem with Titanic is that Titanic was almost like a Schrodinger's liner in that she both did and didn't have enough lifeboats. According to the regulations of the time, she actually carried more lifeboats than was strictly necessary, but nowhere near enough for her actual passengers, and that's because the legislation, when it had been passed only a couple of decades before Titanic set sail, had not really envisaged a ship of 46,000 gross registered tons and capped out at 10,000 gross registered tons. Brendan Buersdorf asks, how did German escort ships compare to their British counterparts? The Germans had converted trawlers that they used and dedicated fleet escorts known as Flottenbegleiter? Flottenbeleger? Maybe. Again, German viewers, please let us know the correct pronunciation below. Literally fleet escort. But how did these compare in overall terms to the British trawlers and corvettes? And did these German ships have any notable successes, especially against British submarines? The Germans used quite a wide range of vessels. The F-boats or F-class escort ships, I think it's more properly Flottenbegleiter, maybe? Who knows? Anyway, that's these things you can see, F9 here. Weirdly enough, given that they were the one dedicated escort class that the Kriegsmarine built, and they didn't build many of them, only 10, they were terrible. They weighed or displaced around about the same as a Flower class, but they tried to make them do 28 knots with 2 main guns and some other anti-aircraft guns, light anti-aircraft guns, but 2 105 mils. And yeah, they were unreliable. They were really bad at staying stable and seakeeping. Some of the worst characteristics that you'd find on German destroyers pretty much are all enabled in this thing as well. So yeah, the one dedicated fleet escort class, really, really bad and didn't really accomplish all that much of anything. The 2 arms of the German surface escort force, such as it was, that had any real success against British submarines were either the converted trawlers, which all have UJ insert number here. They managed to sink a few British subs. And the M boats, or M-type minesweepers, which then ended up being converted into all sorts of weird and wonderful things. They essentially, to a certain degree, became the Flower-class corvette equivalent of the Kriegsmarine, kind of a do-everything small vessel. And, comparison-wise, they're actually very similar. These are R boats, which are the next step down, essentially, small, the equivalent would be a small sub-chaser or a power boat. They're a little bit bigger than an E-boat or a Schnellbooter, but not by much. But they, thanks to their sheer numbers, made up quite a lot of German close coastal escort forces. But the M-class minesweepers, they are between 700 and 900 tons, depending on if they're standard or full load, and they're 18 knots, so very similar to a Flower class overall in that respect. They are a bit more heavily armed gun-wise because, like with the F class, they have a pair of 105mm guns, whereas obviously standard Flowers just have the one up front, 4-inch gun. Then they have, depending on the type, a slew of anti-aircraft guns, again, on average, maybe a slightly heavier anti-aircraft armament than a Flower class, but because they're designed as minesweepers, they do have depth charges, but they don't specifically have a design to be covered with depth charges, and obviously in the British case, hedgehogs and so forth. And that meant that their utility, their potential for utility was good, but not fantastic. But even then, they didn't have a huge amount of success against British submarines. The single greatest killer of British subs was actually mines, followed largely by Italian anti-submarine forces in the Mediterranean. The total British submarines sunk by German surface forces associated with anti-submarine activity, so that's putting together all dedicated escort forces, the minesweepers, the Ms, the UJs, the anti-sub trawlers, and including a captured Greek destroyer that was turned to German service, and a Q ship as well, adds up to somewhere between 7 and 9, because there's a couple of question marks over 2 of the submarine losses, whether they were sunk by a ship or by a naval mine. But even if we say 9 total, then that means that good old Johnny Walker aboard HMS Starling was individually significantly more lethal to Kriegsmarine U-boats than the entirety of the Kriegsmarine surface escort fleet was to British submarines. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, Germany's most effective submarine in World War I was the UC-2 class, which notably had an internal mine-laying capacity. Yet, come around World War II, the Germans did not add such a feature to any of their U-boats. Why? Well, there's two elements to it. One is that the Germans did have a class of dedicated mine-laying submarines, the Type 10s. Very little is ever heard about them because, well, there weren't that many of them, and they ended up being used for cargo carrying relatively quickly. Some of them went on a few patrols laying mines, but that was really about it. There were a couple of additional projects for mine-laying submarines of a slightly smaller size, because the Type 10 was quite a hefty one for as far as German submarines went, but they were never built. But then when it comes to the Type 7 and the Type 9, the two most common types of German submarine in the Second World War, both of them had the ability to carry torpedoes or mines, because they had mines that could be deployed via their torpedo tubes, which, when you compare to the UC-2 class had dedicated mine launchers, much the same as the Type 10 did, but the Germans effectively took the view that if you were going to use a submarine to lay mines by World War II, they generally seemed to think that it was better to just have a submarine that could do either job, except some of the Type 9s weren't fitted for mine-laying operations, but most were, and as I say, the Type 7s could as well. The advantage of the Type 10 was that it could carry significantly more mines, so you could send it to lay a relatively extensive minor minefield off of a port, as opposed to kind of half jobbing it with the Type 7s or the Type 9s. But part of the problem was that in the interim between World War I and World War II, the Germans, and to be honest everyone else, had recognised that submarines operating close into shore, that being an enemy shore, would be subject to quite intensive search and attack by enemy anti-submarine assets, which were significantly more capable than they had been in the First World War, and of course aircraft, which had become pretty much ubiquitous. So the old mission profile of a UC-2 in the First World War of getting in close and dropping mines off was a lot more difficult and potentially fatal than it had been, whereas taking a Type 7 or a Type 9 further out to sea, outside of the range of Allied air cover, and then cooperating in wolf packs, was seen as a much better way of doing things. Yes, torpedoes were bigger than torpedo tube launched mines, so you couldn't carry quite as many of them, but obviously if your submarine can go out and sink some ships and come back and reload and do it again, that's hopefully going to work out better for you than a submarine going out laying slightly more mines, of which a much lower percentage are actually going to hit anything, and significantly risking that sub not coming back in the first place. Cutlass myself asks, in naval design, many ships in the period the channel covers, and some even later, have an aft deck that is a deck lower. In some larger ships, more than a deck lower. What was the reasoning behind this? I've heard that on some ships in heavy sea conditions, this meant that waves could wash over the rear deck, and there's problems with the ship when that happens, so what advantage did the ship designers feel that it gave? It's all to do with weight and stability. Now, where exactly this step down occurs on a ship depends very much on the ship in question. If you look at some destroyers, obviously not the flush deckers, but some other destroyers, the brake actually comes before the bridge, so it then becomes known as the forecastle brake. As you can see here with, I can't recall if this is Queen Elizabeth or Valiant, I have a feeling this is probably Valiant. You can see it actually comes almost amidships, almost midway down the ship, and then on some other ships like Hood and some corvettes and frigates and so forth, it's much further back, and it's a quarterdeck step down. And all this is because of the interplay between freeboard, which is the height above the water of your hull, which is good for seakeeping, versus weight and stability, where obviously you want things to be as low as possible to give you the best features for that particular element of your design. And normally you would go forwards, so you would want your bow to be as high as possible with a lot of freeboard. But if you make your entire ship that high, then things like your gun turrets and your barbettes, which are very, very heavy, are now very, very high up above the waterline, which has very, very large implications for your ship's stability and also significantly increases the overall weight of the system, because if your barbette has to be, let's say, 7 or 8 decks above the waterline, that's going to involve a lot more metal work than if it has to be 3 decks above the waterline. And this is why the forecastle would step down. And also, obviously, if the hull steps down, that's also an entire deck, as you said, potentially more, which isn't there. Therefore, its weight isn't there, and its effect on stability, but again, being relatively speaking high up in the overall ship, also isn't there. So it makes the ship more stable, saves weight, which means you can fit more things on it. Now, this can, of course, have downsides because it creates a stress point along the ship, and that can lead to structural failure through just wear and tear over time, metal fatigue and so forth. And as you mentioned, it can also lead to the stern actually settling in the water, and that's a combination of things. It can just be perhaps the stern isn't particularly high above the sea in the first place and waves just come across it. You've also got what they call sit, which is as a ship goes faster and faster, it tends to sit slightly by the stern, at least for most warship type hulls of this period, which of course will lower the stern even closer to the water. And then of course you also have the bow wave and its waves and troughs running along the hull, and if you end up with kind of a perfect storm of a fairly low quarterdeck in the first place, plus a reasonable amount of sit, plus a fairly high wave and trough system coming off of your bow because you're going pretty quickly, you can end up with your stern pretty much awash in what would otherwise be relatively calm conditions. Hood is reported to have had this problem, and there is certainly some footage and pictures to suggest that this was an issue. But of course, for that to happen, that particular combination, you have to be going at a certain speed such that you basically get a trough in the right place to just come up and over, or perhaps really close, and then the natural wave pattern of the sea reinforcing that in constructive interference will cause it to come up and over fairly regularly. So of course you can just make everything taller and have a flush deck design, as you see on something like, say, a Fletcher class destroyer or an Iowa class battleship, but you are explicitly accepting a trade-off between not having your stern underwater, but potentially losing out a little bit on some spare reserve stability and displacement, which you could use for other things like armor and weapons or machinery and so forth. And if you want to be really sneaky and try and enjoy the best of both worlds, you can have a continuous sweep down, so your deck isn't actually staying at the same level all the way down. So you would have a high forecastle and a low stern, but if you run the deck as a continuous sweep along, you don't have that break point, which would be the structural weakness. A random dude with hobbies asks, why would a blunt head, as in on a torpedo, be more hydrodynamic? Many marine animals are pointy, whilst some others are blunt. Well, when it comes to submarines and torpedoes, a blunt head or a rounded head is better than a pointy one for a few reasons when it comes to hydrodynamics. One of which is drag, because ultimately your torpedo or submarine has a given diameter at its widest point. Obviously, the torpedo is mostly cylindrical. Submarine may or may not be cylindrical, maybe teardrop shaped, profiled, whatever. But the point is that ultimately you need to reach that diameter. Now, if you're going to do that with something that's pointy, that's going to be very, very long. That has a separate issue in that a very, very long pointy torpedo is going to have issues fitting in a torpedo tube, and also packing. If you're looking at acoustic homing torpedoes or even fuses for detonation, you're going to have issues packing those into a very narrow pointy end. But just from the purely hydrodynamic perspective, a nice rounded tip that very quickly reaches the maximum diameter of the thing that it's attached to, whether that be a submarine or a torpedo, actually has significantly less surface area than a long pointed nose, which also reaches the same maximum diameter. and the total surface area upon which the fluid, in this case water, is exacting its force upon, will to a large extent dictate how much drag is experienced by the object in question. And so in that case, at least the speed regimens with the of torpedoes and the density of water, then having a blunt nose is actually more hydrodynamic. And for similar reasons, a blunt nose on a commercial airliner is better than a pointy one. Once you get supersonic or near supersonic on an aircraft, you want a pointier nose, and likewise if you look at the rocket propelled and so forth, the ultra high speed, like 100 knot plus torpedo designs that have come out since the Second World War, they tend to have a pointed nose for similar reasons. Towards the end of the Second World War, there's another reason as well, which is that once you get to torpedoes that begin to maneuver, whether they be dumb maneuvering ones like the Italian ones that zigzagged through a convoy, or acoustic homing torpedoes, if you have a long pointy nose and it's moving at high speed and you try and turn, you're suddenly going to get a lot of induced drag because you've got a very long moment arm, and you're going to get cavitation streaming off of that point, which is going to create a lot of drag on top of the drag created by the large surface area. And that's all going to slow you down and potentially throw you off course, which isn't a good thing, whereas a nice rounded head is just going to let you turn however you want. And the other thing is that another major element of drag on a body moving through fluid, obviously in this case water, because for aerodynamic purposes air is also a fluid. Another major cause of drag is a boundary separation. So if you have a flow of water coming over your hull, let's say, then when it gets to the tail end, if it separates quite violently and abruptly, you can get turbulence and, in the worst case, cavitation, and all of that leads to a lot of drag. Whereas you can use various tricks, a little bit like how transom stern does on the surface, to try and separate that turbulence away from you. But one of the easiest ways of doing it is just to have a long tapering stern area, which teardrop shapes on submarines, fish, as you can see here, that's why this galleon picture is up here, and torpedoes tend to have a more tapering aft area to allow a smooth transition of the water flow away from them. And for very complex hydrodynamic reasons, which will probably require a 3D model to explain, if you have a torpedo-like sort of relatively blunt but smoothly curved head, you get a rather nice flow going down the body, which is then relatively easy to smoothly separate off. If you have a really long pointy nose, then you get a rather high speed flow, relatively speaking, coming along the body, which can separate off in and of itself and can be difficult to get rid of without turbulence and drag coming up, although that does tend to be at higher speed regimens. But then again, as far as underwater projectiles go, torpedoes are some of the highest speed things around, certainly in the time period the channel's looking at. Cold Warrior asks, since Mahan's doctrine was so misunderstood, how could it have been applied by the Japanese in World War II? Specifically, once you have control of the seas, what do you do to win the war? Well, Mahanian doctrine, specifically in the context of a Japan versus United States fight, does run into a few problems if you're trying to apply it from the perspective of Japan. Not because there's anything fundamentally flawed with the Mahanian doctrine per se, if you properly understand and apply it, but simply from the colossal mismatch and between the two sides and some of the geographic realities as well. Because what Mahan's doctrine calls for is you hit your enemy's fleet hard enough to cripple or destroy them. Obviously, ideally destroy them, but crippling their ability to operate as a peer force is good enough, at least, at minimum for a time. You then have control of the seas, for the most part. There will always be small parties of enemy raiders, cruisers, frigates in the age of sail, that kind of thing. But if you have mostly uncontested control of the seas and you are capable of moving large amounts of trade and or troops around without being significantly counterattacked, then you now can enact the second part of Mahanian doctrine, which is to exploit your control of the seas. Now, the Japanese did, to a certain extent, do this, perhaps wittingly, perhaps unwittingly, in as much as they recognized that they had to disable the US Navy's ability to counterstrike them in a big way, hence the Pearl Harbor attack, at which point they would rush out and occupy all the various territories that they did, the Philippines, various Pacific islands, starting making inroads into the Dutch East Indies and New Guinea, etc., etc. So that's the territorial control aspect of it. But then to actually cripple or destroy your enemy in total, Mahan's doctrine holds that you have to hunt down the remnants of their fleet, and you have to ideally blockade your enemy and essentially grind their economy down if you can't launch a direct invasion yourself. And of course, this is where geographic realities come into play. No matter what the population differences were, etc., the United States is just physically too far away for the Japanese to launch any kind of significant ground invasion. So if you can't physically take control of your enemy's homeland, you need to blockade it. This runs into another problem, which is, well, the US is very far away from Japan. Now, Japan does have some long-distance submarines that can, in theory, conduct some form of blockade, or certainly disrupt shipping and make it very difficult. But this runs into yet another problem, which is that the United States is a little bit of an outside context problem when it comes to sea warfare, because for most countries, they either lack economy, a fully stable economy without exterior trade, which would normally be done by shipping, or they lack certain resources which are vital to their war effort. And so, you can have an and/or situation there. So if you look at, say, Germany, actually in both World War I and World War II, the German economy could, to an extent, be kept going without access to global trade, at least on a war footing for a while. But what Germany did lack was certain resources, food to feed its total population, and certain key industrial resources to maintain the war effort. And that's where the Royal Navy blockade in both World War I and World War II hit really hard. Slightly less hard in World War II's case, because the Germans had conquered significantly greater amounts of Europe and were able to loot it for all it was worth. But Germany could be eventually brought to heel, and very nearly was in the First World War, by simple resource starvation, and in some cases literal starvation. The problem with the United States is that not only is it very far away and therefore difficult to blockade in the first place, if you manage to get there, it's very big, which further complicates the problems of trying to blockade the thing, especially because it's got two massive oceanic coastlines, so you've got to be able to get significant forces onto both sides, Atlantic and Pacific. But then, even if you have a very large fleet and you are able to enact a pretty substantial and effective blockade of the US coast, which, for example, the Royal Navy was able to do towards the end of the War of 1812, you then run into another problem, which is by the 20th century, the United States is pretty much self-sufficient for almost all practical resources when it comes to running a war economy. The US isn't going to starve if you cut off overseas access to food. It's got land borders with Canada and Mexico it can trade over anyway, but even regardless of that, the US is pretty much self-sufficient in food. It's self-sufficient in things like steel, rubber, engine parts for warships, gun manufacturing. It has almost all of the trace elements that you need for armor treatment and gun barrel manufacture and so on and so forth. It's got plenty of sources of materials to make explosives, etc. So you could sit and blockade the continental United States as of the 20th century for a very long time. And yes, eventually it would start to take economic damage through lack of access to world trade, because a portion of the US's economy is made up of global trade. But as long as they want to stick on a war footing and just, stick it out producing guns and planes and tanks and ships, without any further intervention, it's actually very difficult to get the US to give in. It was a slightly different situation in the War of 1812 because the United States occupied far less land area and was much less resource independent. And also in 1812, a much greater portion of the US economy was based on overseas trade. And for a smaller navy like Japan relative to the United States Navy, it essentially means that although Mahan tells you this is how you win a war at sea, that is, there is a presupposition of you have the navy to enable you to do that. You can't just do it with, 2 rowboats and a torpedo. And that's essentially the problem the Japanese had. You could, in theory, apply Mahanian doctrine, certainly maybe in the 1900s and the 1910s, if you were something the size of the Royal Navy against the US, although even then the sheer size of it would make things a bit difficult, especially if you've got the Anglo-Japanese alliance going, which would boost the Anglo-Japanese fleet at that point. But the closest that you could come to implementing true Mahanian doctrine in World War II, if you were the Japanese Navy, would be once you've secured your major industrial objectives, so things like the Dutch East Indies, rather than trying to establish a network of defensive island bases from which you'll then withstand the inevitable American assault, which is what they were trying to do during the Battle of Midway. In theory, you should instead focus on hunting down any major surviving elements of the US fleet. So, for example, you might actually do the attack on Midway in a bid to lure the Americans out, but rather than focusing your primary strike power, in that case your carriers, on Midway, you would attack Midway with perhaps surface ships using shore gunfire and bait the Americans out that way to then hit their fleet. So your primary objective at that point is the American fleet. And you would use your fleet of long-distance submarines to try and enact some kind of economic blockade on the American west coast, obviously in that particular case in cooperation with the Germans attacking on the east coast. That's going to be difficult, but there's still a fair amount of material that's moved by ship up and down the US coastline, so if you can significantly disrupt that and force the enemy to divert their resources and attention inwards, that will buy you more time, and you might score the occasional nice success against a major warship that's transiting up and down the US coast, especially in the early stages of your attack. Is it going to win you the war? No, not if you're Japan. But it might reduce US fleet numbers, especially of major surface combatants, far enough and divert attention to anti-submarine coastal work long enough to significantly prolong the war, especially if you manage to not lose a significant portion of the Kido Butai at Midway. BK Zhong asks, had the War of 1812 continued and the Americans built their own freshwater first rate to counter HMS St. Lawrence, how would the naval situation on Lake Ontario have turned out? Well, it would have been an exceptionally interesting set of circumstances, because in response to the launch and commissioning of the St. Lawrence, the Americans had actually designed and started construction on 2 of their own first rates for the Great Lakes. So yeah, instead of having just Pennsylvania, the majority of American first rates would actually have been Great Lakes ships, not oceanic ships. Those would have been the USS New Orleans and USS Chippewa. I think that's how you pronounce Chippewa. Exactly how many guns those are supposed to have carried is contentious. Some sources say they were 106 gun ships. Most sources suggest perhaps 120 gun ships, and some even suggest there were 130 gun ships. I would tend to suggest that they probably would have ended up carrying around 130 guns, including carronades, but probably would have been pierced for 120 guns or less, because that seemed to be the general trend around that time period. However, when the British got word that the Americans were building a response to the St. Lawrence, the British started a response to the American response to the St. Lawrence, which were 2 ships, again, ostensibly designed for 112 guns, the Wolf and the Canada. And New Orleans, Chippewa, Wolf, and Canada were all laid down in 1814 and were being built throughout 1815 with the idea, obviously, of getting them in the water, getting them launched and then commissioned and ready to go by 1816, because you have the winters on the Great Lakes that pretty much obviated any attempt at operational use of warships. And like New Orleans and Chippewa, they would have probably carried more than 112 guns. Now, the interesting thing is, because these ships didn't have to go very far, so they didn't need quite as many supplies and so forth as ocean-going first rates, every single one of the first rates that we're talking about that would have been built on the Great Lakes, whilst they carried fairly large numbers of guns from being first rates, the actual type of those guns was also very, very powerful. You know, no 12 or 18 pounders on the upper gun decks here, just 32 pounders, 24 pounders, and then 32 pounder carronades, 68 pounder carronades, all sorts of running games like that. So in terms of actual broadside throw weight, they would have been absolutely ridiculously powerful for the time. And so you would have essentially had a race of who can get their additional first rates commissioned and ready for the start of the 1816 campaign season. The Americans would have the slight advantage of having started theirs slightly sooner than Wolfe and Canada. The British would have the slight advantage, much as they had with St. Lawrence, of being able to just take wholesale, very complex parts of the ship, like the rigging, the masts, etc., off of existing warships that could dock up on Canada's east coast and just truck those in wholesale, whereas the Americans would have to manufacture those rather complex items on site or somewhere in the area, somewhere in the United States, and then move them in as well. So that would be a slight delay. So potentially you could have ended up in 1816 with 5 of the most powerful first rates on the planet at the time duking it out with each other over a couple of dozen miles of lake, because the 2 ports where they were being built were not very far away from each other. Damien Porosky asks, what exactly is raking fire and why is it so important? In Age of Sail terms, raking fire is when a ship is able to, what would later be called, cross the T of an enemy ship and thus deliver a full broadside, usually in staggered sequence, into the enemy's stern or bow. This has 2 major advantages for the attacker. Firstly, you can open up with your full broadside. The enemy can only return fire with whatever they've got for bow and stern chasers, so the proportion of firepower is close enough to near enough getting a free shot, which is quite important, because then you're not taking any damage from return fire, really. But the other factor is how that ammunition then interacts with the enemy ship, because there's no such thing as armoured enclosed bulkheads for pretty much the Age of Sail. Some of the later ships of the line, the big ones, would have a sort of maybe a wooden bulkhead, but that's a bit debatable. But in any case, the point is, if you are side by side with an enemy ship and you are trading broadsides, then your shot will go through the side of the enemy ship, assuming it doesn't hit one of the enemy guns. It then may interact with a person or 2, maybe a gun on the other side, maybe some kind of wooden beam somewhere or pillar somewhere in the middle of the ship, and then it will leave the other side of the ship. Now, for the people that shot has interacted with, that's not a good thing. And as I said, you may dismount a gun, or very, 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 very unluckily 2. But that's about it. And also, even if you do, by some sheer magic happenstance, manage to, say, knock the wheels off the carriage of one gun and the ball continues on and knocks the wheels off the carriage of the gun opposite, you still only reduce the broadside firepower facing you by a single gun. Conversely, if the, let's say, cannonball round shot at this point is travelling from stern to bow or bow to stern down the whole length of the ship, that thing's got more than enough energy that if there happen to be 4, 5, 6 men in its flight path, or in the flight path of the fragments that it's creating, it will very happily take every single one of them out. And similarly, especially if it's coming through the stern windows and has basically lost 0 energy entering the gun decks, it might knock about the carriages or the cannons of several different gun mounts. So, you could lose 3 or 4 guns, and potentially through splinter injuries or, round deflecting and hitting people, 4 or 5 people as well in this cannonball's passage. Multiply that by, 15, 30, 50, 60 guns, all firing, some potentially double-shotted or treble-shotted, some with grape shot or canister as well as round shot. And suddenly, not only are you getting a free shot in, but that shot is potentially incredibly more destructive to the enemy than a broadside would be, simply because of the number of casualties it can cause, both in terms of actual humans and guns and other important bits and pieces. C. Babylon asks, what exactly was it that gave USS Constitution such a strong reputation with the British as a threat? It was a combination of factors. I mean, there is a little bit of overblown propaganda, coming from the United States about it, but at the same time, it's not a completely over-exaggerated thing. Constitution was seen as the threat, if you were going to define any American ship from the War of 1812 as a threat, and that's down to, well, 2 related factors. Firstly, Constitution is one of the 3 big 24-pounder frigates, which is what the Royal Navy's orders actually said don't engage alone, as I've covered in the War of 1812 frigate duels series. Propaganda would have you believe that the Admiralty issued blanket orders don't engage any American ship alone in a one-on-one, when in fact the Admiralty orders said don't engage any of the American 24-pounder frigates if you are an 18-pounder frigate and you happen to be alone. So essentially 18-pounder frigates don't engage Constitution, President, or United States, which is a much more limited and much more reasonable thing. But in any case, so those are your 3 ships that you have to worry about. And of those, United States obviously captures Macedonian, but as we saw in that particular frigate duel, Macedonian was not particularly well handled, and, well, let's just say the Royal Navy was not particularly happy with its captain afterwards. President, by the end of the war, had been captured, which meant Constitution was one of 2 left, and of the 2, obviously the other one being United States, Constitution had taken Guerriere and Java, both of which were held to have been much better fought than Macedonian did, and of course, spoiler alert, right towards the end she also took Sion and Levant. So overall, Constitution was a big ship, very powerfully armed, had fought at least 3 successful engagements with British frigates and come off the winner each time, with, relatively speaking, compared to the ships it was targeting, little damage to speak of, and thus of the remaining big American frigates, it was seen as the best handled, the most durable, the most successful, if you like, the most lucky, and that gave it something of a reputation. Although for some Royal Navy captains that was a reputation of I want it, but of the ones that thought that, none of them with an appropriate level of ship managed to get in and fight Constitution before peace was declared, or shortly after peace was declared for that matter. Rob Smith asks, we all know the hazards of putting too much propellant in a gun, but considering there was at least one ship's engineer who decided that his ship wasn't going to go very fast, Canopus, was there ever a gun captain who decided to undercharge his guns? I assume this would be an Age of Sail action, thus a related question. What punishment would he face if his crew didn't lynch him first? There are actually quite a few instances in the Age of Sail of a gun being undercharged. However, that almost always wasn't due to maliciousness. Now, very, very occasionally, especially in the early part of the Age of Sail and in some of the more corrupt navies later on, there were cases of guns being undercharged because people were, hiving a little bit off on the side, which left people with less gunpowder. And sometimes, if a ship was stuck in a very prolonged engagement, or it had perhaps fought in several engagements and for whatever reason was running low on powder, then sometimes the guns would be deliberately undercharged to try and eke out that supply of powder so that, the ship can stay in combat for longer. But the other thing is, and perhaps this is less well known, is that there were specific undercharge charges that were deliberately called for by a lot of navies' doctrines at the time. These could be called half charges, quarter charges, close charges, boarding charges. The terminology varies both in time and by navy. I mean, half and quarter charges are perhaps the most obvious of what they are. But the idea was that, yes, you would have a full charge, which is what sends the cannonball the furthest, and you might use a full charge, perhaps if you double-shotted the gun, because you need the things to get moving. But one of the theories at the time, not necessarily saying that it's correct, but it certainly was a theory, was that if you fired a cannonball with a full charge and it went at a given speed and punched through the side of the enemy ship, then at high speed it would punch a small hole in the side of the ship and punch a hole in the other side of the enemy ship and go on its merry way. Whereas a low velocity ball, i.e. the same cannonball but moving at slightly slower speed, was thought to have more of a smashing effect, i.e. delivering a greater percentage of its energy to the target as it's being slowed down a bit more, and this could create more and bigger splinters and a bigger hole and so on and so forth. And part of this, as well as weight saving, was also the theory behind carronades. Obviously, a big 68-pounder carronade fired a really big ball and was relatively lightweight, so you can mount it higher up. But 32-pounder carronades, for example, were thought to, via this smashing effect, have a greater impact at close range than a 32-pounder long gun firing the same shot but with a full charge. And under this theory, the idea was that you could use a half charge or a quarter charge at close range to cause your long gun to create a lower velocity shot, so you're undercharging it, to create more of a smashing effect. And there was also a somewhat more practical element to this, which was that if you're on a Nelsonian style close range melee, if you have a 32-pounder and you fire a full charge shot into your enemy, it will go straight through your enemy and out the other side, and then it might actually hit a friendly somewhere on the other side of the engagement, which isn't necessarily a good thing. Where, or for example, when Temeraire and Victory are either side of Redoutable, at which point, if you fire a half charge or a quarter charge, that ball will hopefully stop in the opposite side of your opponent's ship, and thus you won't particularly hurt the friendly ship on the other side. Or even if it does go through and through, it'll have so little energy left that it'll kind of bounce off the exterior hull of your friend on the other side. So yeah, undercharging the guns, actually not as uncommon as you might think, and often quite well within regulations. Send Penguins asks, I'm currently listening to Massey's Castles of Steel. Something mentioned during this account of the escape of Goeben and Breslau was that there was a message sent to Admiral Harwood after the Battle of River Plate saying that Harwood's victory there invalidated the Troubridge court's acquittal of Troubridge for his refusal to chase Goeben in daylight with his armoured cruisers. This seems to me to ignore that Harwood did have a speed advantage over Graf Spee that Troubridge's ships lacked, in spite of their arguably similar inferior guns. And for all that was being said about Goeben's fuel situation, Troubridge's fuel situation was just as dire. Am I missing something? So the exact message sent by Admiral Pound to Harwood was, even if all our ships had been sunk, you would have done the right thing. Some other stuff, but the relevant part is then, your action has reversed the finding of the Troubridge court-martial and shows how wrong it was. So part of it was that in World War II, they were looking back with the lens of hindsight. The escape of Goeben, in a lot of ways, could be argued to have led, or at least significantly accelerated, the Ottoman entrance into the First World War on the side of the Central Powers, and with that came the Dardanelles, Gallipoli, all of that waste, and some of the hilariously poorly conducted elements of that campaign, and all the diversion of resources that entailed, which had left a very bitter taste in the mouths of many for obvious reasons. And if at that point the view would have been that anything that could have prevented Goeben from reaching The Ottoman Empire would therefore, in theory, have avoided all of that, and if it avoided all of that, then even the sacrifice of 4 armoured cruisers would have been worth it, because, 4,000-ish crew versus avoiding the Dardanelles and Gallipoli and all the ships sunk and all the men lost. That's not a very difficult equation to balance. But specifically within the Royal Navy as well, the thing that the Troubridge court-martial seemed to hinge on was the fact that Milne had given Troubridge orders, and so had the Admiralty. Well, the Admiralty had given the orders to Milne, and Milne had relayed them to Troubridge, not to engage a superior force. Whereas the Royal Navy, from before Nelson and then Nelson and on down, had kind of made a point of, screw the odds, we're going after the enemy. And the whole thing of, yes, Troubridge had been given orders to avoid engaging a superior force, and therefore he had technically been following orders, therefore you couldn't court-martial him for following orders, was pretty much where that defence rested. If he hadn't had specific orders to avoid engaging a superior force, it's highly doubtful Troubridge would have been acquitted, in my opinion, regardless of the particular merits or not of the potential engagement scenario. Part of the other problem was that it seemed to give carte blanche for Royal Navy captains to decide, well, if I'm engaging a superior force, I have all the luxury in the world to just turn around and leave. I don't have to fight this fight, which, again, the Royal Navy officers really didn't like the implications of. And, in the larger context, you can perhaps understand that. We look at, for example, the Battle of Samar, and the actions of Samuel B. Roberts and USS Johnston are celebrated for the fact that they saw odds well above their pay grade and decided they were going to attack anyway. The same thing to a certain degree with Acasta and Ardent taking on Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, or Rawalpindi and Jervis Bay taking on the German raiders that they encountered. Whereas, technically speaking, the results of the Troubridge court-martial would have held that any one of those ships and more should have seen, there is a superior enemy force, I'm just going to leave, and leave everybody else to their fates. Now, what would have actually happened had Troubridge run into Goeben is a completely different matter. You can wargame it out in multiple different ways. Yes, there's fuel situations on both sides, there's the gunnery situation and so forth, and the problem is that you can make arguments either way. You can make arguments that, yes, in theory, Goeben could just refuse to allow Troubridge's cruisers to close to a distance where they could hit with their guns, and he could hit them at longer range with his guns. The counter-argument to that would be that, frankly, Goeben didn't demonstrate particularly brilliant accuracy at extreme long-distance firing, and given the results of the factually better equipped for long-distance firing Invincibles that went down to the Falkland Islands and how much ammunition they had to expend at long-distance firing to get rid of 2 German armoured cruisers, the idea that 1 battle cruiser against 4 armoured cruisers could actually dispose of all of them with long-distance fire, or even significantly hit all of them or some of them with long-distance fire, it is definitely arguable. Not to mention, of course, the fact that in World War I, you were lucky to get decent coordinated fire in a 1v1 engagement. If you are doing that, well, there's 3 other armoured cruisers that therefore aren't being fired upon by either anything or anything accurate, which would mean 3 armoured cruisers have essentially practice day firing lines on Goeben, of course, assuming that they can get in range. But then how can Goeben, if Goeben can keep the range on 1 ship, can it keep the range on 4 ships that are closing a three-dimensional pincer net around it? And then, of course, there's also the argument of perhaps it doesn't matter particularly whether Troubridge wins or loses. Because if he wins, fantastic, great, he's stopped Goeben flat dead in its tracks. But even if he loses, as long as he manages to do a reasonable amount of damage to Goeben, whether delaying it so that the battle cruisers can catch up, doing enough damage that it has to seek shelter in a nearby port where it can be blockaded or interned, or damage it and force it to expend enough fuel that it physically can't reach the Ottoman Empire, or perhaps it sinks on the way in a storm or something. All of those outcomes are significantly better than Goeben reaching the Ottoman Empire, so maybe even it would be worth the sacrifice of all 4 armoured cruisers. This is the debate, and personally, I think Troubridge probably should have engaged Goeben, but admittedly that is a little bit influenced by hindsight and what happened as a result of not doing so. But that's a personal opinion, and I fully acknowledge that, as I just mentioned very briefly, you can make perfectly legitimate arguments for why he shouldn't have done, and why the course of action he took was the correct one. And back and forth it can go. King Brock says, you briefly mentioned her in Drydock 294, but I, and more importantly my fiancé, would like to hear more about Jeanne de Clisson. Well, as I say, I do need to do a Wednesday video on her at some point, so that'll be obviously be in a lot more detail. Somewhat complicated by the fact there really isn't any decent public domain artwork of her. No one seems to have painted or illustrated her at the time. It's certainly not in any great detail. But in any case, also known as Jeanne de Belleville, or the Lioness of Brittany, for reasons that will become fairly apparent fairly quickly, she was born as a noblewoman, and as the sole surviving child of her father, that meant she inherited all his estates. And in the medieval period, if a noblewoman had estates, they were attached to her. So if another nobleman married her, then the family had combined estates of both the noblewoman and the nobleman's estates, which obviously would make the nobleman very powerful because it's the medieval time, so he was therefore the head of everything. But in something that might strike people as a little bit unusual for the supposed backwardness of medieval times, but when you take into account dynastic protections and heritage and stuff, is perhaps less surprising. The policy was that if the marriage dissolved for whatever reason, the estates that the woman had brought into the arrangement went with her. So, if they were divorced or the husband died, then the woman was free to remarry, but she still had all her property and estates associated with her. The only exception, of course, being if they had children, then one of her children would be in line to inherit those estates, or at least part of them, depending on how many children there are and how it will end. But anyway, the point was she was seen as a particularly good catch for political and economic reasons, apart from anything else. She was married twice before the relevant marriage. Didn't last particularly long, either of those, although the first one did last a little bit longer. But in 1330, she married, and I'm going to apologise, French speakers in advance, but I'm going to try this, Olivier XIV de Clisson, who was another nobleman. There was then a bit of a civil war over who would become the next Duke of Brittany. Olivier de Clisson seems to have unfortunately taken the wrong side, and then under false pretenses, it seems, although again obviously the whole thing's highly propagandized, was lured over onto French soil proper, arrested and then executed despite Jeanne's best attempts to free her husband. Due to said attempts to free her husband, she was also judged in absentia to be a traitor. And considering that her husband had been lured to his death by false promises, and also obviously not particularly happy about being judged a traitor herself, she swore retribution against the French king and his noble supporters who were responsible for this, that being King Philippe VI. At which point she rallied her supporters, went on a little campaign of destruction across Brittany, attacking French-held fortifications, and then led her supporters off to a fortified castle, Castle Island, which she held. And from there she equipped a small fleet of pirate ships, and then spent the next 12 to 13 years rampaging up and down everywhere from the Bay of Biscay all along the English Channel, basically looking for French ships, boarding them, slaughtering almost everybody, leaving a handful of survivors, depending on which account you believe, either 2 or 3, or occasionally, as they say, she was left just the one, to make sure that they relayed the message that this is what happens when you mess with Jeanne de Clisson, and then, of course, took all their stuff and used the money and the supplies, etc., to further her campaign of essentially economic warfare against Philippe. And she pretty much got away with it, because at the time you have one of the many Anglo-French wars going on. So when the next phase of that developed, of course, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. She sided with the English, and then she would eventually actually marry for the fourth time an English knight, at which point she seems to have decided that a decade and a half of burning and pillaging French property was sufficient revenge for her former husband, and she seemed to have settled down to the usual business of nobility, mostly taking each other to court over perceived slights and thefts of land, and eventually passed away relatively peacefully at the reasonable age of 59. Rebel Skverl asks, how did the term gunboat diplomacy get started? And given how small actual gunboats tended to be, how useful were they in intervening in various overseas conflicts and disputes, particularly in the 19th century? Well, gunboat diplomacy as a term actually seems to be a bit of a retroactive thing. It shows up in, as far as I can tell, roughly the interwar period to describe mostly actions of the mid to late 19th century, although a little bit before that in some cases and somewhat after it in others. And the idea of gunboat diplomacy essentially is the enforcement of your strategic goals, aims and wishes by a display of naval power. This could be done with fleets, but this was big and expensive, and so in the mid to late 19th century it was very often done by gunboats like this one, HMS Bramble, and this was for a few reasons. Firstly, gunboats were relatively cheap and easy to build, so there could be a lot of them. They could be all over the place doing all sorts of things. Because they were quite small, they could also negotiate rivers and shallow coastal waters that perhaps the big ships would struggle with, which made them able to sail right up to the problematic area and therefore be a lot more impressive than a ship that was, somewhere over there on the horizon. Quite often, even though they were fairly small, they still possessed far more firepower and protection than the locals could muster. If you have small arms and your enemy has what on the field would be considered a medium to heavy field artillery and light metal armor, and they can just sit in the river and shoot at you with high explosive shells all day with relative impunity, they're effectively as much of an outside context problem as a full-on battleship. And also, they very often didn't have to use their guns specifically. Obviously, if they show up in numbers, that looks quite impressive as well. But part of the idea was that by showing up, in this particular case, flying the white ensign or whichever other flag is in question, they could just show up and go, hey, look, we, as representatives of insert country here, do not want you to do this thing. And yes, we may only be a single gunboat, but the implication is that if you mess with us and you don't do what we want, a lot more like us and bigger than us will show up, and then things will go very, very badly for you. So you don't really want that. So maybe you can, give in right now. Which also, in some respects, offered some local rulers a bit of an out, because they could be seen to be negotiating with a representative from a relatively small ship and come to some kind of joint amicable conclusion, rather than rather obviously giving in the face of an entire battle fleet. As far as how useful they were, well, for the people who used them, they were certainly seen as quite useful, both in directly interacting with various local rulers and in various standoffs and disputes with other major powers. Of course, if you were on the receiving end of them, then you would think they were perhaps a little less useful and a little bit more annoying. But essentially, they allowed a navy to exert its will and dominance over a local area without the expense of actually having to deploy a major battle fleet. But of course, it required you having a major battle fleet to back up any threat if somebody was dumb enough to mess with your gunboat. Brian Stevens asks, here's a bit of a fun one. We hear a lot about Iowa versus Yamato. How might Warspite have fared against Yamato? Obviously, plot armor would, of course, mean an easy win for His Majesty's ship, but absent the plot armor, what are your thoughts? I mean, in a straight-up daylight engagement, Warspite sans plot armor is at a significant disadvantage compared to Yamato. She's much less well protected than Yamato, so Yamato's guns can hurt her at a lot of different ranges, and conversely, Yamato's very heavily armoured, so it's much harder for Warspite to hurt Yamato in return. Yamato is faster, as well, which doesn't help. And Yamato obviously has bigger and meaner main guns and more of them. So for Warspite to do anything but lose to Yamato, you're essentially looking at, in nice calm daylight conditions like you can see here, there is one potential route for Warspite to pull off a win. Now, it might sound exceedingly implausible, but bizarrely enough, everything I'm about to describe not only did actually happen to various ships in the Second World War, but also you've got to remember that Warspite does hold the joint record with Scharnhorst and Eisenhower for longest range hit against a moving target in battle. And so the idea of a long-range engagement is not exactly implausible. Now, of course, yes, Yamato on paper can massively outrange Warspite. That's, a given. However, as I've said multiple times before, once you're talking about engagement distances much beyond where Warspite actually hit Giulia Cesare, the statistical chances of you actually hitting somebody who's doing anything or even approximating the most basics of maneuvering are pretty much slim to none. So, realistically, even a daylight engagement that's not just going to be a pointless waste of ammunition is going to happen where both sides can actually shoot at each other. And say Warspite has a track record of excellent gunnery, Yamato has a track record of excellent gunnery, it's plausible that some hits may be scored by either side at long range. Now, in that case of a daylight engagement, it is theoretically possible that Warspite could score a Giulia Cesare style hit on Yamato's funnel and reduce the speed of the Japanese ship, which would obviously open up tactical, if not necessarily advantage, at least level the playing field. And of course, she could also score a hit that disables Yamato's primary rangefinder array. Now, of course, Yamato does have other backups that can feed through, rangefinders in the turrets and so on and so forth, but they're lower down. They're not necessarily smaller, but it will affect Yamato's ability to fire accurately, at least for a little bit. And that might give Warspite the opening to get more hits in, because as you tend to find in naval battles, he who gets the first few hits in tends to subsequently get more and more hits in, apart from anything they've found the range, and presumably the other guy hasn't. And the more you degrade the enemy's ability to fire back, not only does their ability to hit you get less and less, but in theory they should probably be doing something like evading, which could throw off their own aim. It's exceptionally unlikely that you would get that sequence of events, but hitting on the funnel and hitting on or near to disable the primary rangefinder and thus affect the enemy's ability to fire back, both did happen, and Warspite was even responsible for one of those shots, so it is, at least in theory, possible, but exceptionally unlikely. The scenario which is much more likely, if you want Warspite to have anything like a decent chance against Yamato, is a night action. Simply put, ideally before Yamato is fitted with radar. So that means before late spring 1944, at which point obviously Yamato is just reliant on night vision equipment or low light equipment to try and spot Warspite incoming. And of course, Warspite, especially in sort of 43 and early 44, has quite a nice radar suite, but she has a radar suite going back further still than that. And essentially at that point, you're talking about something like the Battle of Cape Matapan or the first night action of Guadalcanal. Not the second night action of Guadalcanal, Washington and South Dakota versus Kirishima, etc., where essentially Warspite obviates the range and speed issues by just closing in, spotting Yamato on radar, lining all her guns up, and in accordance with British policy, closing the distance as close as she can, right up until it seems like Yamato's noticed something, so Yamato's guns start twitching, at which point Warspite just goes, speed fire mode, point blank range, dump 15-inch shells into Yamato as fast as humanly possible, kind of like, Washington versus Kirishima, or indeed Warspite versus various Italian cruisers. And at that kind of close range, the 15-inch guns shouldn't have too many problems penetrating anything that's not Yamato's turret faceplates, And if Yamato's caught really on the hop with her guns trained fore and aft, might only have to go through Yamato's turret's side plates. And if Warspite can get a couple of, like, 2 or 3 good salvos off rapidly and cause critical damage to Yamato, that may actually prevent Yamato from mounting a meaningful response, especially if Yamato is now on fire, which will somewhat make firing back using optical rangefinders very difficult, because of course all your night vision will be ruined, which is basically what happens in South Dakota, at which point Warspite can take Yamato apart at leisure. But, you know, that's a night action for you when one side has radar and the other side does not. Valhalla's Crazy Destroyer Captain section asks, in an earlier Drydock you said that from certain angles it would be possible for a submarine captain to mistake USS Texas for a British R-class battleship. What kind of angles were you talking about? Well, first of all, you've got to bear in mind the U-boat is going to be seeing this from wave top height, potentially quite small, potentially a little bit unclearly, especially, you know, depending on what visibility of the day is going to be. So some things that might immediately seem very obvious to you looking side by side in the comfort of your own room may not be quite as obvious to a U-boat captain, but the primary angle at which it would be possible to mistake a R-class battleship and USS Texas would be essentially from the front or from the port or starboard bow quarter. Obviously, if you're looking at it from a side profile, the fact that Texas has an extra gun turret is rather obvious. From the stern, this kind of recognition issue that I'm about to describe could also happen, but is perhaps less immediately confusing. But, you know, this is Revenge in 1940, for example. So obviously we're looking at this from a profile looking down from an aircraft. You can see the tailplane there just on the left. But if you can briefly imagine for a second looking up from roughly this angle or a slightly finer angle, if you're looking for identifying features of Texas, well, what are you looking for? Dreadnought hull-forming hull casements? Well, they've got dreadnought hull-forming hull casements. 2 twin heavy turrets up front? Yep. Conning tower, range, and maybe some form of rangefinder and substantial bridge structure? Yep. Tripod mast? Yep. Big fighting top-of-top tripod mast? Yep. So that describes Revenge, as you can see here. That also describes Texas. If you're not close enough to see the fine details, or you don't have the recognition drawings that are precise enough, it's entirely possible that you could mistake one for the other. As I said, obviously, broadside shot, maybe not quite so forgivable a mistake, but certainly from the front, very, very possible a mistake to make. And that brings us to the end of this slightly extended Drydock. I just had a list of questions and I had to answer them all, so I did. Even if it took 10 minutes longer than usual. So thank you very much for listening, everyone, and hope to see you again in another video. Toodles for now.